Michelle?
Daniel,
OG
OG Rose,
Rose?
and we're going to ask Michelle what she's thinking about because that's really fun. Michelle, what are you thinking about?
You're very sweet, handsome. You're very sweet. Well, I guess I have been thinking lately about the ethics of transparency
Mm,
because I think that it can be tricky to navigate. Uh, well, we talked recently about like discernment, right?
yeah.
Well, having discernment as it relates to what you communicate and what you don't communicate,
Mm-hmm.
especially in your closest relationships and your most kind of intimate relationships.
Right.
I think that there can be a way in which speaking or not speaking is from most of like the wisdom traditions is a big deal, right? It's a big
Yeah.
deal, like when you talk, when you don't talk, and there seems to be an emphasis on don't talk too much, really,
Yeah.
honestly, in general. Um, but obviously, conversation is a part of life, and knowing how to do that in it like well is important, and that's why you also need to be able to use silence well in
Yeah.
order to do conversation well. But I do think that sometimes there can be, I want to say, kind of a lack of attention or thought behind if it's always the most, like, the best thing to do to be transparent, which I do think tends to be thought of as like the way you are open and the way you are close and the way
Yeah.
you are, vulnerable. Like there is something to vulnerability for sure, but it's not so much about like a never saying. It's more about the timing,
Yeah.
right? And the automatic default of transparency as care,
Yeah.
or like as being caring, or
Yeah.
as being open or loving, or
Yeah.
all of those words. So I've been thinking about that. I do think it's an interesting topic, and I just think that I mean, to me, it took me till like basically being in my late 20s, the early 30s, to really, really, really understand just how important it is to be measured. I think with what you say, when you say it, how you say it, how you say whatever. Now the other ditch on the other side of the road is just to like be a vault, and you have so much. But this is the thing: it tends to be quite easy for us as humans to talk when we maybe shouldn't talk,
Yeah.
and quite hard for us to talk when we really should talk or say the thing or whatever. So, anyways, I've been thinking about that. That's
Well, I think generally people often in life swing from just saying everything and then there's unintentional consequences and then they go to never speaking or always
Clamming
being
up.
off clamming up.
Yeah.
So one of the issues about actually critiquing or thinking transparency, it should be noted that that's actually in a sense a way to save transparency. Because what ends up happening actually is most people as they get older they just kind of don't talk as much, or in their intimate relationships there's been so much hurt or misunderstanding that people clamp up, right? So there's a way in which you have to critique transparency to save transparency, right? Because usually what ends up happening is if you're completely transparent you end up in repression, which a lot of people, funny enough, will emphasize transparency precisely so you don't repress, but what you fear is what comes onto you, right? Because what ends up happening is when people just say everything they feel, like, I'm upset with you. Because here's the issue: where do you draw the line on transparency? Is it just in data? Is it in emotions? Is it in feelings? Should you...
every thought that comes to
your mind, right? So, it's actually not good to always say that you're upset. Sometimes you need to realize you're upset because you're in the wrong and just take it to yourself and get over it, right? And you making that verbal, what are people to do? How are they to respond, right? What is the potential value add, right? But then there are other times where not voicing when you're being taken advantage of can lead to trouble, right? Yeah. So the problem is very often when people talk about transparency, there's always this kind of, sometimes, you need to speak up. Sometimes you don't. There's kind of this acknowledgement of bothness. But the problem is, bothness is kind of useless if you don't have a heuristic of discernment. If I say sometimes you should speak and sometimes you shouldn't, what does that do for you, right? Except go, yeah, okay, it feels like knowledge. But here's the trick. Like in Hegel, a dialectic or, a bothness, although bothness, there are different kinds of dialectics. There's A versus B, and then there's A passing over into B because it entails otherness. Hegel's is more of the second. as Holfgate or Dr. Nicholas or different people will emphasize. But very often people will acknowledge bothness, but then proceed to not necessarily develop a way to think bothness, and so they will ultimately just practice the zeitgeist. And in America, as someone like a Susan Cain says in her book Quiet, we're in an extrovert culture. Mm-hmm. And so the zeitgeist will be very heavy on the side of transparency and talking, right? Yeah. Now, if you're in Japan, the zeitgeist is on introversion, and the problem will probably be on the side of not talking, right?
Yeah, yeah.
But ultimately, just noting the value of both sides ultimately always means the zeitgeist wins. You have to think the situations. You have to think actively, situation by situation, to really discern what should be said, what shouldn't be said, what's the value and what's not. But again, if you exist in a zeitgeist where people almost view even considering not speaking as immoral or not trusting, then even to have that sort of discernment results in you potentially running into people you care about being upset with you, right? Yeah. So that then quiets the motivation to think the problem. But then once you do that, you just are going to be transparent all the time. And I'll give it back to you, but there's a long history as well of the tension of unveiling. We were speaking with Ross on how the Bible is a story of God's got a problem. People need God, but if they experience God, it can kill them. Mm-hmm. So God has to unveil himself at a certain rate that people can handle, or it will be too much, right? Mm-hmm. Well, Lacan talks about the real and the symbolic and the imaginary, and if we experience the real too much too quickly, or without preparation, it destroys us, right? Mm-hmm. There is something about human beings that require a process of unveiling. Like, we know that with children. You wouldn't throw children into the most intense emotional experience. We all naturally aren't transparent with children. We all actually have, just obviously with children, a certain sense that there are some things you say and some things you don't, right? Yeah. But then at some magical point, that stops, right? Or can stop in people's minds. But if transparency, it's not really transparency or not transparency, it's unveiling, with the UN in parentheses, the rate of unveiling something, and that's always relative to where a person's at, the situation and development. And so that's a factor that's always at play at any point in people's lives. And so it's a problem that has to be thought all the time. It was central to Dante, it's central to the Bible, and I think it's central to human experience in people like Lacan. And I don't think simply asking, is transparency good or bad, is getting at the discernment of and process of that unveiling we have to think seriously.
Yeah, for sure. And I think too, the point you brought up about how it sort of seems ironic, but actually the transparency can lead to repression.
Yeah.
Point is very fascinating, because you would think it's the opposite, because it's like, I'm not repressing, I'm just being transparent, I'm just being like completely open. But the issue with that is you may also end up putting, it's like, the funny thing is that whenever there's what we could consider like repression, I always feel like there's also, in a sense, it's opposite too. Yeah. I mean, what if you think to yourself, oh, I'm not repressing because I'm being transparent, well, you may be repressing your ability to deal with that on your own. Yeah. Now, one might say, well, that's not a virtue. Like, you should be able to share with other people and, kind of be able to do that together. Maybe. It depends on what it is. It really depends on what it is. But it's, there's usually that sort of bothness at play. And in let's say, in maybe having some sort of discernment about not saying something, there is a way in which, on a low order causality, like we will talk about, it seems like, oh, well, you're repressing that, like you're not really sharing it, like, but we assume sharing is to not repress, right? Where like I just said in the example, you could be repressing your own ability to endure that in a type of in a mode of silent suffering or solitude. And it's, but it can really be, it can be difficult to, in our like you're talking about, in the American culture at least, to see why that would be so important to be able to do, because you could also seem like you're just hiding things or lying, or omitting the truth when
Yeah.
it could simply be a matter of, again, timing, where at some point that may be something you maybe even write a book about. Who knows? I'm just, but at the time, it's not something, it's something that you perhaps in, again, the measure of not speaking is maybe harder.
Yep.
And not that the virtue simply is about it being harder, but sometimes it does need to be hard so that you can become the diamond, right? Like it's hard compression so that you become brilliant through that, or like there's a brilliance through that.
Yeah.
And yeah, I just think that it can be, I think in, like you're saying to Susan Cain's point in her book, like the extroversion of the speaking, it's in a way that can be easier, but then it brings upon itself its own type of hardness too.
Yeah.
Simply because it's hard to know the interiority of everybody else. So even the possibility of actually being transparent is maybe a false concept in its platonic form, right?
Well, absolutely. I mean, we know there are times where when a person speaks out of anger, they shouldn't. Like you just tell us, like they should. You can tell when a person is getting angry from a lack of maturity. Take the dad at the mini league baseball game. He's being transparent. He's angry at the ref, but we know the person shouldn't, right? Well, you see what I'm saying? Like the doctrine of transparency is in practice inconsistent.
Yeah.
Like no one is fully transparent, right?
Exactly.
We don't actually think people should always voice what they feel because we, in many circumstances, consider that immaturity or hot-headedness, right? So there's a mysterious standard that people actually hold to that is there, but then in not being thought about, ends up just being random almost in its application, and then you get unintended consequences in different things. Because there's often where people do want to speak just so other people know what they're going through and they feel validated in the difficulty they're going through, right? And they want to be, they want to talk about how something is hard so that people validate them and make them feel better about it, right? Sure. So there's a way in which, no, you actually need to learn to hold yourself up in that thing for yourself without validation, because if you're only able to do things that are validated, there's a limited horizon of what you can do, because it will always be, well, the zeitgeist wins again, because that's basically the theme. When you don't think the problem of unveiling, the zeitgeist wins, right? Yeah. And if you are only able to do what you're validated in, almost by definition, that will reflect the majority, that will reflect the zeitgeist, that will reflect what most people are doing, right? To go beyond that, or to chart your own course, it would by definition require you to be able to do things without validation. And very often transparency and where people talk about affirmation, those go together. Usually the people that are big on transparency are also big on affirmation, and they don't see anything wrong with affirmation. And really what's going on often with transparency is people want a culture of affirmation. They want a culture where people are affirming one another, and that doesn't sound bad. But the problem is, if your motivation and capacity to do something requires affirmation, again, almost by definition, that means your horizons are probably going to reflect the zeitgeist. It's probably going to reflect the majority, because that's what people know, and that's what people are going to affirm. And anything other than that, they won't affirm. And also, too, your own brain is trained to only think that which is affirmed.
Yeah. So
then you don't even realize the thoughts you would have had that would have been alternative had you developed more internal capacities to do things without validation, right? So you can't even think the thoughts that you would have had, because your brain is naturally trained to seek that which is socially and collectively affirmed, of which transparency is the mechanism of inviting affirmation, or inviting people to feel bad for you too. I mean, which is another form of affirmation, because, okay, other people feel bad, this is bad, I'm affirmed that this is a bad thing, right? So I think transparency and affirmation go together a lot.
Yeah, no, I think it's great to bring that up, and I think you're quite right. I think you're quite right about that. Two things came to mind. One was the idea of like, well, the zeitgeist will take over if you're not thinking it, right? Maybe somebody's like, well, what's so wrong with that? I mean, this, if obviously the zeitgeist is a zeitgeist for a reason. People seem to be breathing
It
in
may
that
not
air.
be. It may not be bad, but it's. I wouldn't take that bet. It's like philosophy. Philosophy is like a fire extinguisher. Most of the time, you don't need it, but when you do need it, it's really, really dire. And yeah, the zeitgeist obviously works most of the time. My concern is when it doesn't. When it doesn't, the
Right.
consequences are quite dire.
And also, if you think about trends or something on a macro or in the mainstream or something, I think that most people, well, there's a way in which there's some how do I put this? There can be skepticisms about where does that zeitgeist ultimately lead,
Yes,
right?
absolutely.
I mean, so if you have any thoughts of like, well, let's just make it, if on a more personal level, people experience the zeitgeist impacting their family lives or their relationships or their ability to communicate. Like the zeitgeist is what it is what infiltrates as the medium and mode of a lot of our engagement. So that's important. Like, how's that doing for you? Really be honest with yourself. And so the idea of pushing back on the zeitgeist is not to say the zeitgeist, like you said, it doesn't. Sure, usually it can work. It can, but it's almost like it's not necessarily going to lead you to a preparedness for when it doesn't work, right?
Correct.
And yeah, I think it's interesting you brought up Japan. I feel like it was through a certain Japanese animation really that like you start to learn the value of like words, like how much and that can be the strength of a more introverted culture.
Yep.
But obviously that would have its own pitfalls when you go in the extreme of that. But just realizing like how much words mean, and that something is said, and it really, you start to really realize like, oh wow, that it's quite powerful. It's quite powerful to speak. And we were talking about it the other night, but just this idea of communication truly being like connected to our understanding, experience, and almost perpetuation or furthering of like the divine experience. And so that's why too I think it's like when it mentions in James, like the tongue is a small rudder, right? It's like it's a small thing, but it steers the course of your whole journey, right? Your whole life. And and again, it's like we seem to know this or acknowledge it, but I do think it makes it challenging that today, like one of our most, and Verlier will talk about this, or Owen mentioned that Verlier will talk about this, but a lot of the advancement technologically has been in communication mediums, right? So people can talk a lot more quickly, a lot more readily, more across the globe instantaneously. Unheard of. Yep. You're talking to me about how wild and almost scary it was for people to even hear a voice apart from a body on a phone, right?
Yeah, that's right.
So all that to say, I don't think that helps us either in terms of slowing down to question transparency or to question just sort of the openness. And it's funny, I used to always say like, oh, I'm an open book, and I kind of thought of that as like a good thing.
Yeah.
And I'm not saying there's no benefits that can come from vulnerability, right?
Sure.
Being able to share one's own testimony or story or whatever. But it's like there's also what's your context, who's hearing it, what does that make them think about or deal with now, da 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 da. And I think there's something about. There's also something that seems to require more trust in having measured language or measured sharing, because it's kind of a easy way to feel like there's a deep connection to know, oh, we just always tell each other everything, which I do think there are definitely spaces in people's lives on a very small scale, but that can be places like that, like where you can tell everything, right? But I also think that there's a way in which you cultivate more trust to know if the person didn't tell me, there's a reason, and trusting that person. And actually that also being what cultivates the deepness of that relationship, you know. So yeah, said a bunch of different things there, but
Well, no, I mean, whatever the culture is going to moralize the culture. And so, being an open book is a good thing, right? And also you see all the stories of the quiet guy who ends up being the serial killer or something, right? So there's this association of quietness with scheming and being bad in different things, right? And the idea of an open book is like, well, we know what's going on in their head, and that's good, right? But again, the truth, as we learn in psychoanalysis, human beings simply can't handle what's going on in one another's heads. We can't handle the fullness.
We can barely handle it in our own heads.
Yes, that's right. We're scared of ourselves, right?
Yeah.
Like we don't want to know the truth of ourselves. We
Right.
deny the truth of our desires. We deny the truth of our feelings. All the stuff Aspasia said. Human beings, we deny ourselves to ourselves, right? Why do we do that? Because we do not naturally handle ourselves very well. So why should other people be able to handle us, right? And also true, in all honesty, since we actually are all naturally hiding from ourselves, without years and years of work and thinking and psychoanalysis and figuring out even who we are, then there's a real sense in which transparency is not actually transparency. Because you are hiding some things even to yourself. So whatever is transparent is not going to actually be transparency, right?
Right.
Because, like, as you know thyself. What if you don't know thyself? Can you be transparent? So what are we talking about when we talk about transparency? Because if humans are self-deception machines, if we're full of repressions that we have to naturally work through, and it's very, very difficult, and if we don't even always know what we think, what are we making transparent? What we're actually often making transparent is our processes. Our active thinking, our thoughts live before they're fully formed. But the problem with overly exposing people to processes too carelessly is they may not be ready for it. They might not be able to follow you. They might be overwhelmed. It may interrupt on their processes. Because I guess the problem is when people talk about transparency, they talk about it's like mere data exchange. Like, this is me, and I give it to you, and it doesn't affect you. But we don't give each other full positions because we hardly know them. We give each other our active processes. And like when you share stories with people, you're sharing what you remember, not the whole experience, right? So humans are by definition filtered. We're always filtered.
Yeah.
Simply by finitude, limited memory, limited not remembering everything. We can't recount everyone's experiences in the situation we're telling a story about. So humans are always filtered. And so the idea of being fully transparent is actually impossible. No one is actually fully transparent. It is always, to some degree, curated, right?
Yeah.
And you see, basically accepting that is, if the person who's going to emphasize unveiling with the UN in parentheses, the measured and kind of process, is simply, in a sense, accepting the fact that full transparency is impossible, right? Also, too, a lot of times those people have the idea that transparency is intimacy, and you don't just give it to a stranger on the street. To really tell people what you think and your beliefs and what you're going through, that's kind of a gift to your closest people, right? Like your spouse. And so there's also an idea that transparency can be inflationary, where your most precious things kind of they cease being kind of precious in their medium because you're just giving them to everyone, left and right. And then, of course, if you're a Christian, it's hard to deny the fact that Jesus is not fully transparent. He is very often leaving, concealing. He's speaking in parables. He's confusing. So I think
Literally hiding.
Yeah, literally hiding from people. So there's something also about transparency, if overemphasized, that simply can deny the reality that human experience is always filtered. And really what we're giving to people is not just because the way people talk about, the way people talk about transparency is they're giving one another, this is just my fully formed self and I'm sharing it with you and do what you will, as if it doesn't affect the person. Yeah. But really what you're doing is opening them to your process, which is live and dynamic, and now you're in it. You've it's more like you're not handing them an inanimate object per se that's not dynamic. You're opening them to like a river that's running. You are more like a river that's running, and you just kind of like open the dam per se and washed over them with your life, which can overwhelm them. So it's more like humans when they speak to one another, it's not that we're really just exchanging data. It's like we're opening up a valve. And if we're not careful, we can wash one another away.
Yeah. No, 100%. And I think if that sounds extreme to somebody, honestly, then we may not have stopped to think about what actually does end up happening.
Yes.
Because you can deny that. Like, you could be like, that's a little extreme, Daniel, you know?
Yeah, sure,
I don't
sure.
know about that. Like, that's a little extreme. And aren't we supposed to be, like, open to the other in their openness, and if they want to just tell us all the things, you know? But the reality is, that stuff is in your brain now.
Yeah,
like,
it's in your
brain. You can't unhear it, and there's a way in which it really does set people off thinking about it now.
Oh, yeah.
And maybe even trying to intervene, or maybe not, or maybe feeling helpless, or feel, you know, there's all sorts of stuff that come with that. And there's questions that can come up that are very difficult to answer. And, you know, this isn't to promote, like, avoidance or fragility. I think in a sense, the robustness comes from the individual unto themselves in their own processes. That's where, hopefully, such a discussion can shed light on the importance of that.
Yeah.
So that we can then, when we engage with each other, be more robust. Like, you know, because, you know, it's like, oh, well, it's anti-fragile. We'll just all just, like, throw these things at each other, right? We'll get stronger. No. Like, that's like saying you're anti-fragile to, you know, just
Jump off a cliff.
Yeah, jump off a cliff, or, like, try to lift 300 pounds,
Yeah.
or catch 300 pounds, or something like that. Like, no, like, we know that wouldn't work, because you have to work your way toward that strength and that capacity.
Yep.
So, but it's funny, because I do still feel that kind of nagging ethic of, like, but, you know, if you loved, if you cared, if you trusted the person, and you know that they trust you, you just be completely transparent, completely open.
Sure.
But I will say another thing too, is that this is where, you know, I brought it up. It's complexified by technologies, because there would be natural limitations on how much time overlap you have with individuals, given many things, you know, your logistical circumstances, da-di-da-di-da, and you would just literally not be able to communicate certain things over other things. And I think that when you have physical presencing, I can understand that you may, in a kind of, on some sort of practical level, end up being kind of like an open book with the other person, because they literally are kind of living a very similar life or schedule or way of being with you. So then you know, you end up just, the time overlap is so much greater, and the experiential overlap is so much greater, that you essentially, there's nothing you can keep from each other. Essentially, right? It's when you are in different logistical places that then the question arises: what do you share, what do you not share? And then the person, why would you be thinking about it in terms of what do you share, what do you not share? Well, because it's literally a time factor. Like, how much can you share in a message, or, you know, say share in a phone call or a letter, or blah 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 blah. Like, that's where you suddenly are curating what you say and what you don't say, because you're having to be like, it's coming from a place of making the effort to do so, right? Whereas in the when you have all that, like I said, the time overlap, logistical overlap, there's no extra effort one must make in order to share and talk or think out loud or whatever it is, you know. And so, but the communication technologies make it almost as if we're constantly with everybody.
Yeah, absolutely.
Right, or it can be like that. I mean, obviously you're not actually with everybody all the time, and we know that, but there's always that potentiality, like we talked about, with also that puts you in the deliberation space, right? Where there's that, oh, but I could, and they could. So then if they don't, or if I don't, what does that mean?
Yeah.
Or,
don't we love each other? Yeah.
So I think there's, like, it kind of goes to what we were talking about, like accepting certain determinations, about realizing that, you might feel quite quiet compared to the self you were before, or whatever, simply because of your logistical limitations or your determinations that you have made often or that have resulted often from choice, sometimes not, but often from choice.
Well, I mean, the matter of unveiling was part of the world. and technology makes it individualized into choice. And so now we have to bear doing the unveiling, whereas before it was just part of life. It was more natural that even if you never thought the problem of unveiling, let's put it this way, 100 years ago, you could have been hard on the side of transparency and still naturally had unveiling occur simply because of the effects of distance and geography and technological limitations.
Right, unveiling like with the UN in
Yes.
You're veiling a lot.
Yes, basically in this talk I'll always mean unveiling with the UN in parentheses.
Yeah, just for the audience.
Yes, and the dialectic between inclusion and holiness, we could also say with Ross Bird. But now, if you have that ethic hard on the side include, the technology literally makes it possible for you to always talk to the person, and thus to always ask yourself the question, why am I not talking to the person? And then you feel bad about it, right? So technology really, in expanding choice, greatly amplifies the problem of transparency. Yeah. It almost perhaps was not even a problem until technology, just simply because of the natural determinations of time, geography, space, etc., so forth, right? Now it is a problem that you have to choose and thus potentially feel bad about. And so that changes the game quite a lot.
Yeah, no, that's very good. And I also think about the book by Barry Schwartz on the paradox of choice and how, but it did make me think like, well, but isn't that good, Dan? We're giving everybody an opportunity to choose.
If they can handle it. You were making the point about the anti-fragility, and what I would just say is, basically, but this is the issue, your internal space, your internal solitude, all that is where you develop anti-fragility. Like if you never have let's put it that if you never have solitude and thus veiling per se, then you're not going to be able to handle people's processes. This is the rub. Like, how do you if people open up and let you into their processes, their river, how do you stand in it? Precisely the spirits of solitude. That's why it's a dialectic, right? Like, you can experience people's processes if you've experienced times where you've developed yourself, where you've thought things through, where you're able to handle it, right? But if everything is transparency, then you never develop the capacities needed to handle the rivers that people open up, the processes that people open up on one another. You simply find yourself going with it, or you feed off one another to an ever intensity that may cause a lot of trouble and often looks like, well, drama. Because what usually happens when people start being transparent, they say, I'm really upset about this. The other person says, well, what about that thing you did a month ago? And it becomes everyone talking about, they put all their drama on the table. That's usually what happens when people are transparent. There's transparency with friends that can just be the constant calling one another. That's risky. But actually, you can't really say that when the couple have the drama Olympics, isn't that transparency? Where everyone's talking about, well, you forgot to take out the dishes. Well, you forgot to do the trip back and forth. These are all the things they repress, right? Well, we all know that's bad, but is that not transparency? So, that's kind of the problem, is that the ethic of transparency forgets all the exceptions, that are obviously not good. You shouldn't be building a list, like, a building of list of things you're pissed about and then one day blow up. Well, what's blowing up usually? That's when the person's finally being transparent. Oh, good, they've moved into being good. Yay, they're doing... No. They actually should have worked through those things, right? And basically what philosophy comes along and says, yeah, those obvious examples where transparency is bad, actually there's a lot more of those in more subtle ways and more wise and discerning ways going all the time. Like, what are all these holy mystics, quote unquote, where they just sit there in silence, right? Because they actually know if they tell the young gun the truths of the cosmos, for example, the young gun won't understand it at all. The young gun has to go through experiences first. I mean, that's the other big factor of all this, is basically we're not ready for things. Many of the most important things in life, you're not ready before there are certain experiences you've had. And actually, to make them transparent before those experiences may ruin your capacity for the experiences, or you may not go seek the experiences, right? Like, if people made overly transparent to you something like marriage is hard, then you may not get married. But again, like we were saying in our other talk about the word want being not enough to understand human choice at higher dimension. Likewise, saying marriage is hard but it's also beautiful. Beauty is hard, right? And beauty raises you to higher virtue and higher holiness, right? But like if you make transparent, say if you make transparent the difficulties of relationships in the wrong way, the kid will say, well, then I'm not getting married, and thus they'll never have a chance to potentially move toward a higher beauty, right? So that's an example where when you're speaking to younger generations, you have to be wise on what you say, but at the same time, if you act like marriage isn't hard too much, then they'll feel tricked. So you have to what? Discern the right amount of exposure, the right amount of truth, the right amount of emphasis, the right kind of wording, all of these different things. I mean, look, one of the problems you've seen, and I'll give it to you, like when so many people are like, well, this is the truth of being a parent, and you're talking about how sick you are and how difficult and everything's messy all the time. The problem is if you're not careful, it becomes too one-sided, where people are like, well, then I won't have kids, right? And so, but then if you only show the happy things, then people can feel it's fake, right? Well, this is where something like literature and art comes in, and you have to tell stories. Stories entail the good and the bad, but in an arc, in a harmony where they come together, right? And I actually, in all honesty, I don't think it's by chance, and also in an attentionalist economy, where we're making a lot of content more than say literature and stories, that you have an ethic of transparency that can't think unveiling, right? Because like if all you're showing is 5-minute clips, that's always going to be one-sided, almost by definition, and so there's not even the thought of unveiling, which is kind of the work of literature. Literature is a story of a whole arc that's gradually unveiling as you're understanding, right? So if we don't have a literary or artistic society, it's more of just kind of quick clips and content, then we want to be transparent because what's the thing? What's the new thing, right? So I think transparency and kind of content creation also go together in the attentionalist economy.
Oh yeah, definitely, for sure. And well, yeah, two things are coming to mind. I was thinking about Baudrillard and how he'll be big on kind of analyzing, trans movements of different types, transhumanism and all of that. But it's interesting how it's like, it's also a transparency. It's kind of that nature, in the sense that it seems to be something we're hoping to like transcend our divide or something like that, as humans. And yet a lot of times, like you were getting at earlier, we do it like it can be done. And then we also do it often, like if we're honest with ourselves. Then you did say that, like where we were talking about affirmation or validation, like we do it often. Transparency is almost more for us to transcend the divide we feel with ourselves. Yes. Not even just so much with the other person. And so it's that's important to realize, because then we will start to maybe not just be so susceptible to assuming that the ethic, right, of the transparency is actually love, caring, and good connected relationships. It's like it might just be an egoistic, like an egoic, potentially an egoic thing where you're really being transparent for your own self, right? Because then you have the potential for validation or not having to think about it because you've put it on somebody else's brain, or whatever. I mean, you're still gonna probably think about it, but it's so tempting to just want to, just like how if somehow if you can just say it, you won't have to be burdened by it anymore. You won't have to think about it anymore. So anyways, I was thinking about that.
Well, I'll just say quickly, I really like your point of transparency being a kind of transcendence of division. Because the issue is that, following Zizek, Lacan, all these people, the self is divided. You can't transcend division. You are a divided self. The self is divided. So what you're doing in transparency, if that's trying to transcend the divide, you're trying to do the impossible. And I do think people in transparency are trying to transcend the divide between them and other, to transcend the divide in themselves.
Exactly.
And you can't do that. And you have to come to terms with the divide itself, with the lack, if you will. And I think that's exactly right. I think transparency is a denial of the fact that the human is a divided self. and we have to live with divisions. There are divisions. They don't go away. We have to master them and be artful with them. We cannot transcend them.
Yeah.
I think that's a brilliant point.
Yeah, thank you so much. Yeah, well, I think I just was thinking about Baudrillard, and then what does, I always think that the word transcendence is important as it relates to any type of trans movement, because it often is a type of effort to transcend something. And then the other thing I was thinking about was, I guess like the phenomenological experience of starting to question transparency, or being like slower to assume that, saying is like that, speaking or saying the thing or sharing the thing is like the automatic way you should do it, right? I don't know, I feel as though I remember learning that kind of concept from living in a more rural area, where it's kind of this idea that like, if you need to know, you'll be told.
Yeah.
And if you're not, it doesn't matter it doesn't apply to you, basically. And there's a kind of grace in that. Like, in some ways you can kind of be like, well, why am I not being like led into that? Yeah. But it's interesting, because it's kind of like, the tree of the knowledge of good and evil is a kind of wanting to know.
Yes, huge.
And this transparency and this tell me.
Make good and evil transparent.
And make me included in this, exactly, in like the knowledge of whatever it is. And it's just like, there's a real grace if somebody doesn't tell you that you don't need to know. You don't need to think about it. Mm-hmm. And that's a person saying, I don't need you to be thinking about it, because it's not even relevant to you. And why am I going to put that on your brain to think about?
Yes.
And so, but there was something really, I don't know, there's just this one day I remember with like a dear family member where I don't know what had happened, or maybe I saw them talking to somebody else or say something, and I had that moment where I was like, I wonder what they're saying, or like, what, or is he going to come tell me, or whatever. And then they didn't, and I was like, oh, I must not need to know it then. Yeah. And having to really accept that. Yes. But there's actually there is a real freedom in that. I think so. And so, anyways, I just wanted to talk about phenomenologically, like moving into I'm trying to think of what could be the opposite. Yeah, well, the unveiling, the UN in parentheses. Moving into that, what does those things feel like? I think it can feel like moments like that.
Yes. Well, I think again, that's an example. I think you're pointing exactly right, that people don't want to talk about with transparency. There's often an egoic motivation. Yeah. I want to be included. Why am I not included? Yeah. There's an ego validation you're looking for. Yeah. And also kind of the idea that there's stuff going on that I'm not included in. One is a testament to a divided self you don't want in division, you don't want to be reminded of, but also it can feel, kind of humbling, right? Yeah. But actually it's liberation. And I think to bring that to the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, I think is spot on, because there's a certain, I want God to make transparent. Yeah. But the funny thing is, once they ate from the tree, God was less transparent. He was walking with them in the garden, and then afterwards you couldn't walk anymore.
They're less transparent. They're hiding themselves with.
That's right. So that's kind of the irony. Yeah. Is that transparency actually leads to repression, because you can't handle it.
Yeah, that's such a great point.
Whereas often if you just stay in your lane per se, well then things are transparent. That's the funny thing. If you're able to just accept, if you need to know, you'll be told, then everything you are invited in all spaces. Because you won't go beyond your bounds. You won't go outside and start messing in processes you don't need to be. So people will be happy to have you around. People won't mind they'll want you around because they know they can trust. Well, here's the funny thing. Transparency actually threatens trust. And a lot of times people think transparency is trust. Actually, it can destroy trust. Because I don't know if boundaries are going to be protected. I don't know if people are going to respect processes they need to be in or not. I mean, anyone who runs a business knows that every new person you add to a decision makes it way harder. It very rarely makes it easier unless the people really know what they're talking about. But there's like 5 people who really know what they're talking about, and the other 500 do not. And so including those other 495 would not be good. It would actually create drama and maybe destroy the business, right? So people in business Well, people who are responsible for creating something or making it happen. I think the transparency ethic tends to occur in social relations with people who are just hanging out. But if you're in a business or entrepreneurial context, you know that will not suffice at all. You do not want to tell the boss everything. You don't want the boss to tell you everything. You want to be really smart. And also, the employees that go and ask the boss a question about everything, I'm just asking, they're avoiding responsibility. Like, that's what you see in the work dynamic happens. People act like I'm just being transparent, but really what they're trying to do is avoid responsibility. Because that's the other side of why the transparency ethic is problematic, is because actually people often are looking for a way to get out of responsibility. And once I tell you, and you confirm or say, well, then I can blame you. I can blame you. Because I can say, well, they said I should do it too. They said it was okay. Yeah. So transparency also can be tied to avoiding responsibility.
Oh, yeah, 100%. 100%. I totally agree, and it's a very important point.
Which then means when people don't let you into processes, they're actually taking responsibility.
Yeah.
That's why there's a grace in it. Mm-hmm. And yet, the irony is your ego. I mean, we know curiosity kills the cat, right? Curiosity is a desire for transparency, to make the world transparent, to make it all glass, like that Russian novel. And so there's also an issue where people won't tell you things because they're taking responsibility for the mental weight and for the action. And ironically, I mean, honestly, very important, when Adam and Eve eat from the tree, when Adam eats from the tree, that means they take responsibility for good and evil. Because now they know about it. And does not humanity now take responsibility for good and evil? We're responsible for it. And it sucks. Yeah. You know that. So, like, if you let your ego push you beyond your boundaries, okay, well, now you're responsible. Well, I didn't want to be responsible. Well, you didn't respect the boundary. You didn't respect the line. And so you're responsible now for crossing the line. And what is across the line? And so often when people are not transparent, they're actually trying to, well, protect you from that, shield you from that. When God's like, don't eat from this tree, it's a mercy.
Yeah, that's all very good. Just a little bit of a counterpoint. If somebody's struggling to be open or vulnerable with somebody that they really, in a sense, ought to be, simply because they need to face a fear.
Sure.
Right? Like, let's say it's with a spouse,
sure,
or with somebody you need to right a wrong with, or something like that. What? Because I could see the things we're discussing here about transparency being used to say, well, I won't, I just...
Yes.
Well, transparency is not good anyway. Like, we obviously haven't said that because we're talking about the nuance of transparency.
Talking about unveiling.
Yeah, we're talking about, right.
Yeah.
Yeah. And we were saying, like, at the beginning, where it's not about it being good or bad. It's about...
one-sided.
It's the one-sidedness, and it's the mechanisms of these things. And the important realization about the kind of the inability to actually be fully transparent in some platonic form. But what would that, like, how would you speak to that? I mean, I think about it just in terms of facing fears.
Yeah, that's basically it. I mean,
it.
The main thing is being critiqued is the ethic of transparency, where transparency is always good, which is false. And no one actually lives their life as if that was true. It's just when they're asked directly, or it comes up,
or they feel bad,
about it.
Like we're talking about, it's like, oh, well, like, that's when you get when the choice is like now spread across everywhere all the time because of technology. Then people are like, oh, I feel bad. Like, maybe I'm not being open enough or sharing enough.
So extroversion plus technology and choice create this ethic of transparency, and we're very confused about transparency. Transparency. So the issue is facing fear is the main heuristic, as we talk about all the time. Like, you're supposed to unveil when there's a fear, and you're supposed to veil when there's a responsibility that is yours.
Right. Which you may fear too.
Yeah, which you may fear as well, right?
Which you face in taking on that
Yes, that's correct. So the main guide is fear.
Yeah.
Are you afraid?
Yeah.
And often people are transparent actually because they're afraid not to be transparent. They're afraid.
100%.
They're afraid. Yeah, they're afraid they're making a mistake, so they want affirmation. They're afraid that their choice is wrong, so they want affirmation. Very often, transparency is out of fear. Or the fear of, if I'm not transparent, I'm not being intimate.
Exactly. Yeah.
So I think fear is critical.
Yeah, I think so too. One last thing, I was thinking about this this example of, I don't know why it's coming to mind suddenly, but I was thinking about being way back in like middle school and in youth group, and I had somebody I knew at youth group who was clearly going through some things, or their family was going through some things, but I never knew what was going on. And I remember feeling, well, there's a twofold thing here. One, this person was not, how do I put this? They were participating in maybe what is a potential extreme fault or ditch on the side of the introversion.
Sure.
Where sometimes you don't use words and you don't talk about it, but your body language is like, oh my gosh, something's wrong. Like they're just upset. They're not talking at all. They're not being responsive. They're not really being, like, they just look sad.
Yeah.
And, you know, it's really hard to make them laugh or whatever it is, you know, blah, blah, blah. This is back in middle school. So,
sure.
But, so in a way, they wouldn't tell, like, they seemed very selective about who they might possibly open up to. And there was this kind of, definitely at that point in being a middle schooler, I'd be like, why doesn't she tell me? You know, why won't she talk to me? And I don't understand. And, you know, but she was also kind of going around making sure you knew something with, in a sense, I'm not sure. Maybe she wasn't. I'm sure it was just a hard situation. And then, you know, she maybe didn't have much thought behind the fact that, like, oh, maybe I shouldn't, like, go around to these things feeling, like, looking as if I'm sad, but not
Jesus
telling
speaks about
what I'm going through.
I mean, Jesus speaks about that. If you're fasting, don't go declaring, like, hide things. Like, Jesus, well, this is...
Hiding, but hiding isn't merely not talking about
it.
Your
body...
You also have to, like, you actually
act
have to
like,
which seems like you're pretending or something.
Yes.
But that's where we talk about also the pretending as something that can actually be a cultivation
type
of thing.
Yeah.
But the point is, like, if you're going to be kind of selective or not share what is going on in your world because it might be too difficult, it's not the right timing, blah 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 blah. You shouldn't also use it though as a weapon.
Yes.
It can be. I'm not saying this person did this. Honestly, like, I totally understand. It was probably a very difficult situation, and I don't understand. It was middle school.
Yes.
But you also don't want to use the silence.
Correct.
Like it's speaking, because this person was
that's still transparency. Actually,
this person was speaking exactly. It's a type of transparency of, oh my gosh, their body language is talking so loudly, and yet they're not saying anything except to maybe this one person who they seem to confide in, but now that's a secret, and all these sort of weird, strange, probably middle school dynamics.
Well, you see that happen in couples. I mean, where there's I'm not, the man notably can keep silent, but it's obvious in how they act and their tone and their way of speaking. They're not actually veiling. They're actually very transparent that they're pissed off. Like, transparency is not just...
too. I mean, it's like the silent treatment.
Yeah,
right?
like transparency is not simply a matter of speaking.
Exactly. It's literally like a mode of how you exhibit, a mode of how you, again, like we said, handle in the quiet, in the solitude. How do you wrestle with that stuff so that when you present yourself to others, you're not going to put it on them, unless you decide I discern that it's wise for me to bring this to this person for counsel or for whatever, or so that they realize whatever it is. But it's just
because otherwise, what people will do is they'll actually intentionally not say anything so they can be seen as someone bearing something that they're not saying. Thus, they get moralized, and then when they speak, it has more punch. Or or something. So you can gamify all of these things, right? Yeah. And Jesus speaks to both sides of it. So I think, again, transparency, like you're saying, is not merely about speaking. Yeah. You can't be going around looking angry or upset and then say, well, I'm bearing this, for different things, because you're maybe to some degree. And there is something to say about having an incredibly stressful day at work, and basically just, even if you wanted as hard as you could not to show the stress, it's just going to be in your eyes. It's going to be on your face. But that is, though, where if somebody asks you, is there something wrong? And you say, if you need to know, I'll tell you. Well, then it switches to the other person to respect that. And that's the two-way street of that. Yeah. Where very often... The curiosity of the person who's like, no, tell me what's wrong, what happened at work today, Like, this is common with men. Like, a lot of crazy crap happens at work. And the man actually feels a certain obligation not to go into detail, right? Now, the risk of that, though, is that the man is in a world that the woman doesn't understand at all, and that creates all sorts of problems. But then there's also the element with a woman, or if it's vice versa, the man or the woman, have to understand that if the person says, if you need to know, I'll tell you, that's it. That's the end of it, right? Because you then you create the relational unveiling dynamic with the UN in parentheses, right? And actually, I think it's extremely important for couples to be able to actually do this in the relationship to one another.
Oh, yeah.
Aware of what needs to be known and what doesn't need to be known.
Yeah, well, absolutely, and I think that's all really great. I was really bringing up this person I knew from youth group years ago, because more so to say, wow, that immature, little girl Michelle of being like,
sure.
I wish, I really did feel like I wish she would have told me, but you know what? It wasn't her, like, I shouldn't need to know. Again, that's where that kind of lesson I learned.
She shouldn't have been performing, but you shouldn't have had the desire to know.
Truly.
Right.
I mean...
Which, isn't it funny how much that does to the tree of knowledge of good and evil? This desire to know, kind of. You'll be like, God, I want to know the secret, right?
Yeah. And I almost felt like... So, I'm just trying to... I was really more saying it as a critique on myself of like that... But that does happen. That is such a prevalent human feeling or experience. Yeah. But it's funny because how that played out, I think, as, the little girl Michelle wanting to know and feeling like, I wish she would tell me, like, doesn't she feel like she can tell me, and maybe we could, whatever, maybe I could help her, maybe I could, whatever, savior mentality.
Sure.
But that does show up a lot, definitely, that same urge in a different way when it comes to marriage and respecting the person saying, if you need to know, I'll tell you, and trusting that you're not, because I think it is related in the sense of, tell me, I want to make sure it's not me. Right?
Yes.
Like, that I'm... Because that's another thing. When you're in middle school, you're like, is the person upset with me? Did I do something wrong?
It's an ego thing.
You're like, I need to know because I need to make sure it's not me. I didn't do something. And it's an ego thing. Same when it comes now, 10, 15 years later for marriage, you're like, it's a similar thing. It just has this different form or manifestation in a sense of... But it's the same... It goes back to just, like, feeling this need to know, to feel, I don't know, I guess the sense of, if they feel safe with me, then I feel safe with you, and I feel safe with myself, or something like that. Yeah. And feeling the sense of, oh, you're not upset with me. It's not something I did wrong, which still ends up, like, even though it sounds kind of humble, it's very egoic still.
Well...
But yeah, it's just interesting, because it's like, oh, that middle school self still shows up in ways in your older years, but in a different way, and it's a maturation process from even that point. And I will say, like, I can remember, like, early marriage, that being hard, and then now you start to, I mean, I'm not, like, perfect at it, but you do get better, because when you recognize it as, like, oh, I need to trust, really need to trust.
Well, I mean, what's very interesting, and I mean, it's very clear that the issue of transparency can be strongly tied to ego and pride. Well, this is very interesting, because if there's something about technology that's like, why is the person not texting me and they're upset? And if that's all linked back to the Garden of Eden, then there is something about the spread of technology that may be a kind of spreading of the first temptation. The spreading of the fall over and over again, because there does seem to be something about the tree that is curiosity and transparency. And if there's an ethic of transparency, in the name of community and love, there's something quite sinful, something fall-like about that's repeating affirmation of the ego. Because there's a way in which Adam is affirming the ego. I'm affirming, I'll be like God, right? And, well, God told you, and then ironically it's like, then, you're actually become shameful, right? And so it is very interesting to think that if technology puts on us a choice that's going to lend in the direction for most people and likely of curiosity, transparency, and ego, that's actually kind of spreading conditions of the fall. Which, some people have pointed out that the Apple logo is a apple that's been bit into, like the tree of knowledge. So, but it's very curious. But the main point is that transparency, again, God is not, God's not transparent. God is known analogously and indirectly. Why is God not transparent? Ross is because it would kill you. God has a problem himself, like we were talking about. God wants to be in a relationship with you, but if he is, you might die. So how do you do that? Well, it has to be a story of unveiling, a process of unveiling, and it's not easy. And simply to say God needs to be transparent, well, then you'll die. And it's actually no different with human beings. We cannot be transparent to one another. One, because we hardly know ourselves. We're divided selves. All we can do is open up our processes.
Yeah.
And that's quite a thing. And if we're going to do that, we need to be able to handle it and do it wisely. And then it needs to be with people who are able to enter that process and be, generally as a heuristic, like you were speaking the farm, and they'll give it to you, and is people are like, well, I'm not going to tell you unless it directly affects you, and I need your help, or you being part of it would benefit the process. Otherwise, there's no point, right? And so that's a pretty good heuristic. There's no reason to tell people things unless it will directly affect them. So, but then the problem is this: if people don't have philosophy, what else do they talk about?
Well, and also, you'll talk about, what do you talk about, Daniel? It's like it's like the skill-based society.
Oh, the voice-based society versus the skill-based, task-based society.
That's it. I think that's a big thing, though. Like, when you're in a task-based society, you have more of that kind of rugged, not rugged, but that more clear heuristic.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
That can feel, I guess, a rugged heuristic in the sense of it being very straightforward.
It's very straightforward.
You don't need to know about that because it's not your business. It
doesn't involve you.
It doesn't involve you. Or you need to know because I need your help with this thing.
Yes.
Because there's these tasks you do.
Yes.
And you have to kind of keep your mind, in a way, it's like, well, isn't that like, it's simple stuff, but it's also like, can cut your arm off, like we talk about with tractors and stuff like that. So it's like, it's stuff though that's quite serious at the same time. So you realize that, like, oh no, I'm not going to clutter up somebody's mind that needs to be able to focus and do the job well and do it right. So I think because we don't have a task-based society, we have a voice-based society on the whole today. Much harder to get back to that heuristic, if any.
Well, the only way would be philosophy. The only way is philosophy, because you have to think about it and you have to discern it. And philosophy also is unveiling because it's indirect. It's talking about abstractions as you're working to concrete. It's analogous. It's dynamic. It's moving. Like basically, a task-based society, the heuristic is basically, is the person affected by the task? Can they be involved or not? If not, they don't need to know. And then, other than that, what you should be speaking to them about is ideas, the good, the true, the beautiful, life. You should be creative. Like, conversation should be creativity, laughter, philosophy, truth, beauty, goodness, right?
Absolutely.
And if the conversations are not that, it's logistics and tasks, and you determine transparency relative to who's involved with those tasks, right? Like, transparency becomes very simple in a way with task, and then basically, if it's not a task, the unveiling happens in the process of dialogos. But here's the problem: if you don't have dialogos, well, then you can't do that, and so it becomes a mess.
It becomes
just random. Well, actually, what ends up happening without philosophy, then basically all there is to talk about is what people are going through.
Yep.
And people. And so then transparency must be the ethic, because it is the very lifeblood of the conversation if you don't have philosophy. Like, if people are not transparent, there's nothing to talk about. So that's the problem. Like, without philosophy or ideas or creativity or whatever, you basically require complete transparency, or you're going to not have anything to talk about. So then you're just sitting there, which may be better, right? This is where some just silent couples who don't talk, it's not necessarily worse. It depends. Now, it's clearly not optimal, but then you don't be so quick to assume that that's necessary. That silent intimacy is worse, right? You really need, a voice-based society desperately needs philosophy. Absolutely desperately. because it almost inevitably will fall into a transparency ethic. And once it does that, it's positioned for the fall. It's positioned for the repetition of the Garden of Eden.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, 100%. Well, I enjoyed this topic, Daniel.
Well,
Thank you for always being open to go wherever my brain has been.
No, I think it's important. But I think, actually, that's an interesting word, because I think we talk about transparency when really we want openness. And I think openness and transparency are not the same. Mm-hmm. Like, yeah, we want openness, but openness is going with the flow, going with the idea, seeing where we end up, open to where the dialogue unfolds. In a way, transparency seems open, but actually it's not. Yeah. It's not open to non-transparency. It's not open to veiling. Like, transparency is actually, it's funny you just said that word, because transparency is actually not very open. Like, it moralizes itself. If you're not transparent, you're bad. There's a certain more, so it's kind of interesting, because transparency seems like a simile for openness, but it actually isn't necessarily the same as openness. In my experience, transparent people can often be not very open at all.
Yeah, and it makes me think of like just some glass globe or some yes. glass wall. Like, there's no way that you can open that without it shattering.
Correct.
Right?
Yeah. I mean, there's
what it means to say is like it's not it appears quite open, yes, but you can't get through that.
Yeah, that's very good. That's very good. But often too, like, unfortunately, I think transparent people, they don't realize it. Often it kind of is surveillance to make sure you're not doing what you're not supposed to do. And so transparency seems like openness, but actually it's also checking in.
Well, that works with the glass analogy too.
Yeah,
with like,
exactly.
Let's always be able to see what surveillance, yes, basically.
Yeah.
Let's just be able to see what you're always doing, or
yeah,
so that you can kind of check in on the other person.
Yeah, I think people can hide what transparency is actually doing by conflating it with openness. But really, for me, openness is only like true openness is going with the flow, improvisation, not having an agenda, right? And that kind of requires philosophical training. So to really be open, you need kind of philosophical training.
Yeah. Well, and just really quick, I do think that the concept of like when somebody says, okay, well, I'm actually for transparency because I don't think it's good that people would hide things from each other.
Sure. And
because if you hide things, like it's like Adam and Eve. Now they're hiding behind fig leaves. Like why did that happen? Well, it's because they did what they weren't supposed to do. Da, 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 da. And it's like, well, if you should be able to be transparent if you're not doing anything wrong.
Yeah, but it's Hegel, because the choice between transparency and hiding, the sublation is unveiling with the UN in parentheses. That people are just caught fluctuating between transparency or hiding.
Well, I also don't think that transparency as an ethic actually helps you achieve what you would like or what you're hoping for. Okay, so what I mean,
because if you talk to that person, they're going to expect you to say everything. So then people will actually avoid one another. They'll actually hide from one another.
Well, that's the thing. I guess what I'm saying is, like, if you're like, we should be transparent. Okay, like, let's just say, we should be transparent with each other. You're not being transparent because you're hiding this thing. Okay, so then you're like, what to say that the person, you're hiding this, you shouldn't. We should be transparent. That doesn't usually get the person to want to be transparent.
No,
not at all. Because again, there's that surveillance aspect of it, and you're also kind of, it's interesting because somebody hiding something is actually very telling.
Yes.
In terms of the information you can gain from that, it's very telling about, well, it should be something that you say, wait a second, I wonder why they might be doing that in the first place.
Yes.
I wonder what's kind of going on here.
Yes.
And the push for transparency, I understand it. Like, I can understand where that's coming from. But I don't know that it equips us for the openness, for the being kind of open doors to each other, to be able to actually enter into the otherness of that person's experience, and to be able to, for them to share and pour out. Because a lot of this, like the transparency hiding divide, ends up just staying in a bad kind of antagonistic dichotomy.
It's a power dynamic, and it's just a useless word because also the problem is that people will also say, well, what if you're like sinning? You should be transparent about that.
Oh,
Well,
yeah.
the problem is they're using the word transparent as a simile for confess. You should always confess.
Yeah.
But the problem is they use the word transparent for that, but then they use it over here for openness and relationship and open book. The word is used in all these different areas where it has a tracent of truth to, and it creates the effect overall of being really important. But actually, there's more precise words to use in each of those different situations than this catch-all term transparency, which is too. It's just useless because if you're doing something terrible, you should confess, but call it confession, not transparency, right? You'll get more clear.
And I do think that's really important because when you can boil it down to confessing, you also make it less about that being some personal thing against you. Like if a person is doing something that's a sin or that's wrong,
it's universal.
it's like you're confessing. I mean, in the theological perspective, it's you confess to God.
Yes.
And yes, you confess to the person who it impacts
Yes.
directly. Of
Yes.
course you should. But you can kind of do it. You can kind of recognize it as what would need to be
What's
done.
right.
What the right thing to do,
Yeah.
right? Not simply just the power dynamic that people can get into of, oh, you must be doing that, and that really hurts me. But you keep doing it, you must want to hurt me. And
Well, when
all of
people-
that stuff of transparency versus let's confess before God. And
Well-
because we are sinners, right?
When people
And,
say,
like,
yes.
which kind of gives an equal playing field that makes people often realize, oh, like my responsibility is ultimately to doing that which is the right thing to do, which then will lead to the openness you should be having in a sense with your
The
your loved
emphasis
one.
should be on telling the truth. You should always tell the truth. And when people say transparent, they're meaning tell the truth, right? But then
That's the thing, it's conflated.
it's conflated. So, you should tell the truth. But here's the problem. It is literally impossible to tell another human being literally everything. So if your ethic is transparent, it necessarily means there will always be something that people can be accused of not being transparent about. And thus, the relationship will be very fragile. It'll be fraught with mistrust.
Yeah.
And because your standard is impossible. No one... Because a lot of times it's like, why did you hide that from me? I didn't think about it. You're like, it wasn't that I was hiding it. It was just that it didn't come up. But the person can say, well, it should have. So to emphasize transparency sets you up for trouble. And it's just not a useful concept. Because, you should tell the truth. Yes, you should confess. Yes, you should work to unveil. You should work through a process. Yes, you should know what you need to know. But you should also trust. In what situation does the word transparency prove useful? As a distinct term? Not really. Because again, people are just using it to mean things like confess or tell the truth or be open. Transparency, but those things are only possible with philosophy, and transparency is a second thing. Like C.S. Lewis said, if you tell the truth, you'll also be transparent, but if you're transparent, you may not tell the truth, right?
Yeah.
Because honestly, when people know that transparency is a demand, they perform more. They become more performative.
And they usually hide more. Too,
Yes.
Because they don't. I don't know. I mean, maybe that's not necessarily
they know they're
true,
under
but
surveillance.
that's the thing. I think that's where it can happen, where that dynamic can happen.
It's an irony. You want people to be transparent, they're more scared.
So yeah, if you feel like you're being watched through a glass dome or something all the time, you may resort to hiding as what you feel is your only resort to do the internal processing, right? Or to do the solitude work, which
so you can handle that transparency.